There are bad horror movies, and then there are horror movies that feel like they shouldn't have been made to begin with. But Slender Man should have been easy. You already had one of the most famous internet horror icons ever created, a character that spread across forums, YouTube videos, creepypastas, ARG culture, and basically became digital folklore. For years, Slender Man felt like he was scarier than most studio horror villains because he worked through imagination. The less you saw him, the worse you felt. That should have translated perfectly into film, but instead, what we got was a movie so lifeless that even people who wanted to enjoy it forgot about it almost immediately. And somehow, the weirdest part is, this movie came out during a time when internet horror was already influencing mainstream horror, so this should have worked, but it didn't. So let's talk about it. Before this movie even starts, there's a problem. Slender Man works because he barely has rules. He's tall, faceless, always distant, always watching, and nobody can fully agree on what he actually does. Sometimes he kidnaps children, other times he causes hallucinations, sometimes he can distort reality, sometimes he's just standing there and somehow that's scarier than anything else. That ambiguity is what makes him powerful. But once you explain too much, he becomes smaller. And this movie immediately makes the mistake of trying to force him into generic horror rules. Now he has video triggers, or he has possession scenes. Now he has predictable jump scare timing. Now he basically behaves like every studio supernatural villain from the late 2010s. And once Slenderman starts feeling familiar, he stops feeling threatening. That's the first huge problem of this movie. The story follows a group of teenage girls who watched a cursed online video. After that, strange things begin happening. Sounds familiar? Sounds like every other 2010s horror movie that came out in that era? Yeah, I know. Hallucinations, disappearances, mental breakdowns, forest visions, and eventually Slender Man begins taking over the story. The issue is, none of it is specific. Everything feels borrowed. You can feel pieces of The Ring, The Grudge, Truth or Dare, but nothing forms into its own identity. Instead of building tension, scenes just happen because the movie needs another creepy moment. Characters walk into a dark place for no reason, they split up constantly, they react in ways that don't feel believable, and because the script doesn't develop any of these characters, you don't really care who disappears. And that kills a horror movie really fast, because horror without emotional investment becomes noise. This movie's biggest technical problem, at least for me, is that it constantly mistakes creepy imagery for actual fear. A hallway, a distorted face, branches moving, static noise, a sudden appearance. All the ingredients are there, but atmosphere needs a type of rhythm, and this movie rarely holds tension long enough. A strong horror scene stretches discomfort. It lets silence work, it lets your eyes search the frame, it lets the dread build before anything actually happens. This movie often cuts too quickly, so instead of fear building, you just register visual information. And the scenes end really fast and it becomes really repetitive. Especially with Slenderman, because he should feel terrifying when he's just standing still. He should barely need movement to feel scary. But here, every appearance feels designed to reach a scare beat rather than a psychological dread, which means his presence never fully settles into the scene, and that makes him feel weaker every time he appears. The strangest thing about this movie is that the title character isn't really in it all that much. A villain like Slenderman should control the atmosphere even when he's off screen, but here he often feels visually distant in the wrong ways. He's not mysterious, he's really underused. The digital distortion around him becomes really repetitive. The camera rarely trusts stillness, and when you do see him clearly, the impact often drops instead of rises. Because Slenderman works best when your imagination finishes the image. The more it explains him, the less power he keeps. The movie shows enough to remove mystery, but not enough to create true visual terror. That leaves him stuck in this weird between space, and horror creatures usually fail in that middle space. Too visible to stay mysterious, and too vague to become fully cinematic. What What makes this movie even harder to defend is that years earlier, an ARG called Marble Hornets already proved that Slender Man could work brilliantly on screen, and it did it with almost no budget from what I'm aware of. Marble Hornets understood one essential truth. Slender Man should feel discovered and not presented. The series never rushes him. It lets long stretches of silence do the work. You stare into footage waiting to notice something wrong. Sometimes he's barely there, sometimes he appears for seconds, and sometimes the fear comes from realizing he was in the frame before you even noticed. That creates participation. The audience becomes part of that fear. You search for him, you anticipate him, and because the footage feels fragmented and incomplete, the mystery stays alive. The theatrical movie does quite the opposite. It packages everything too neatly. It signals scares too clearly. It explains too much through conventional structure, and that instantly removes the feeling that Slender Man exists outside the story. Marble Hornets made him feel really invasive. The movie makes him feel scheduled. The difference matters more than budget ever could, because horror often lives in what feels uncontrolled, and Marble Hornets constantly feels like footage you were never supposed to fully understand. That's exactly why that ARG lingers longer than the movie ever really could.
Classmate's life. Last May, they lured her to a wooded area where police say they stabbed her. 19.
The 2014 Slender Man stabbing also changed how people approached this film before release. By the time the movie arrived, Slender Man no longer existed only as internet horror. He carried a real-world discomfort. That made the release even more complicated. And then reports of cuts and edits made this movie feel even stranger. You can feel the missing material in pacing. Some emotional transitions feel abrupt, scenes end before momentum develops, and characters' decisions sometimes feel like they skipped an explanation. That results in a movie that feels often edited down rather than fully shaped, and horror suffers badly when rhythm breaks. Because fear depends on momentum, once pacing feels damaged, nothing fully lands. Slender Man is not one of those famously chaotic bad movies people rewatch for fun. Something like Bye Bye Man, The Ring remake, or The Gallows that were bad structurally, but I still enjoyed watching them. It's something more frustrating. A movie built from strong material that never understands where that strength came from. It had an iconic villain, internet mythology, audience curiosity, a visual identity, and still ended up feeling smaller than fan-made adaptations. That's why people rarely talk about it as offensive or ridiculous. They mostly talk about it as wasted potential, because the scariest version of Slenderman was never the one Hollywood gave us. It was the one that felt like you found them by ancient accident online horror at 2 in the morning and weren't fully sure if what you just saw was supposed to even be there. And once a movie loses that feeling, it loses almost everything. Thank you for watching. Love you. God bless. I will see you in the next video.